What if I told you that a single fashion trend in Europe completely redrew the map of North America? It sounds crazy, right? But that's exactly what happened. We're about to dive into the incredible story of the fur trade, a wild tale of adventure, conflict, and big business, all kicked off because everyone in Europe just had to have one specific thing. And this was it, the Beaver felt hat. I know it might not look like a world-changing object to you and me, but back in the 1600s, this was everything. It was the ultimate status symbol. If you had any money or influence in Europe, you needed one of these. And the demand for them got so huge, so out of control, that this simple hat literally became the engine for 2 solid centuries of massive, continent-shaping change.
So that's the big question we're tackling, isn't it? How on earth could a hat, something so simple, spark wars, build new economies, and lay the groundwork for entire countries? Well, the answer is just a fascinating story of money, geography, and some truly mind-blowing human effort.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we'll look at how that hat craze really lit the fuse. Then, we'll check out the brilliant transportation network that made it all possible. We're going to meet the unbelievable people who powered this whole machine, dig into the conflicts it created, and finally, see how the echoes of this trade are still around us today. At its heart, it was all about supply and demand. You had this massive, hungry market in Europe for beaver fur and a seemingly infinite supply over in North America. That simple exchange was the spark that ignited a whole industry, sending traders pushing farther and farther into a massive wilderness and changing literally everything in their path.
So what was the big deal with beaver fur anyway? Well, the secret was in the felt. See, felt isn't woven cloth. It's made by pressing and mashing tiny fibers together until they all lock up. And the beaver's soft, downy underfur was the absolute best in the world for this. It made a fabric that was warm, totally waterproof, and perfect for shaping into fancy hats. And get this, the best, most valuable pelts actually came from old coats worn by Native Americans. Why? Because all that wear and tear did the hard work of separating the good stuff, the soft underfur, from the coarse outer hairs. Now, here's a little bit of a dark but fascinating side note. To actually make that felt, hat makers used mercury. A lot of it. And over time, breathing in those mercury fumes caused serious brain damage. We're talking tremors, confusion, even psychosis. This was a real industrial disease, and it's exactly where we get the famous phrase, mad as a hatter, a direct line from a fashion trend to a public health nightmare.
Okay, so Europe wanted beaver pelts, millions of them. The problem was that North America was this huge, sprawling wilderness with 0 roads. So how did they build a supply chain that stretched 4,000 miles? Well, the answer was in the land itself, combined with an absolutely brilliant piece of indigenous tech. Just take a look at this map. This tells you everything. A huge chunk of North America, especially what we now call Canada, is just this massive web of lakes and rivers all connected to each other. It has about half of the world's fresh water. So, for the fur traders, the geography wasn't a problem. It was a ready-made superhighway, just waiting for the right vehicle. And here it is, the key that unlocked that whole highway, the birch bark canoe. This was a masterpiece of indigenous innovation. It was made from things you could find right there in the forest, like cedar wood and birch bark, but it was strong enough to haul tons of cargo. And, this is the crucial part, it was light enough that a couple of guys could just pick it up and carry it. But of course, that water highway wasn't perfect. You had rapids, waterfalls, and long stretches of land between river systems. So every time they hit one of those, everything, the canoe, all the trade goods, all the valuable furs, had to be carried over land. That grueling process is called a portage, and it required an almost unbelievable amount of sheer physical power. This image really gives you a feel for what that was like. A big canoe could be loaded down with 3 or 4 tons of stuff. And on a portage, all of that weight, plus the heavy canoe itself, had to be moved by a crew of maybe 8 or 10 guys. This was brutal, backbreaking work, and it created a special kind of person to do it, the real engine of the fur trade. So, who were these guys? Who were these remarkable people powering this massive continental trade network? They were called the voyageurs, French-Canadian workers who became the absolute backbone of the entire operation. To really get a sense of the voyageurs, you just have to know one number, 400 pounds. That's how much stuff each guy was expected to haul across a portage. They carried it in 90-pound bundles, usually 2 at a time, strapped to their backs.
And they didn't just walk, they ran at a kind of trot, bent almost completely in half. It's just a staggering amount of weight, absolutely incredible. And it wasn't just the portages that were tough. The whole job was just relentless. This quote really says it all. They paddled from before the sun came up to after it went down, 18 hours a day sometimes, just paddling, paddling, paddling for weeks and weeks on end. It was, without a doubt, one of the toughest jobs in history. Even their clothes were all about pure function. That wool hat, the toque, yeah, it kept them warm, but it was also a great place to keep their tobacco dry. Their big, baggy shirts helped keep them cool and kept the bugs off. Wool leggings protected them from chafing and leeches. Every single thing they wore had a practical job to do. But here's something that is absolutely critical to remember. For all their amazing work, the voyageurs were only half of the equation. This whole system only worked because of the skill and the partnership of indigenous peoples. They were the expert trappers who actually got the beaver pelts. And in return, they wanted European goods that gave them a real technological edge. So the arrival of all these new goods from Europe, especially things like metal tools and guns, it kicked off a massive and very rapid change within indigenous societies. This new technology was a game changer, and it brought with it some really profound and often very violent consequences. This chart really shows you the scale of that shift. Just try to imagine it. For thousands of years, your society has used tools made from stone, bone, and wood. And then, all of a sudden, you have iron axes, iron knives, iron kettles. Imagine going from fighting with bows and arrows to fighting with muskets. It was a complete technological revolution. And this new technology basically poured gasoline on old rivalries. The fight to control the best fur territories and the trade routes to the Europeans just exploded. It led to a series of incredibly brutal conflicts we now call the Beaver Wars. As you can see on this timeline, groups like the Iroquois, who got gums from their Dutch partners, were able to completely dominate and expand their territory, kicking off almost 100 years of really destructive warfare. But it is so important to understand that indigenous peoples were not just passive customers here. They were incredibly creative and adaptive. They would take things like a European copper kettle, break it down, and skillfully rework the metal into things they needed for their own culture. New arrowheads, jewelry, new tools. They were masterfully blending these new materials into their own traditions. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is all ancient history, but the legacy of the fur trade is still very much with us. So why does a story from 300 years ago still matter? Well, because its echo is literally written all over the map of North America, and you can still feel its effects in our societies right now. This quote just nails it. That 4,000-mile network of rivers and trails, it wasn't just a temporary thing. It became the economic spinal column for a new nation. The towns, the trade routes, the very shape of modern Canada, a huge amount of that was first laid out by canoes searching for beaver fur. The trade also left behind more complicated and difficult legacies. The introduction of guns, for instance, completely changed the game, permanently. And the data from our sources shows a modern echo of this. Today, the firearm homicide rate among American Indian and Alaska Native communities is 4 times higher than the rate for non-Hispanic white people. It's a tough statistic that reflects a really complex history that has its roots way back in the fur trade era. And all of this brings us to one last big question. The story of the fur trade proves that the global demand for just one thing can completely reshape societies, redraw maps, and change environments in ways nobody could have ever predicted. So it really makes you wonder, what are the beaver hats of our time? What everyday things that we ship all over the planet, our phones, our clothes, our coffee, are shaping our world right now in profound ways that we might not fully understand for decades or even centuries to come?